Hi, welcome to Chapter 23, Learning Objective 3. In this particular learning objective, what we're going to look at is what we call the national income identity or the national accounts. Okay, we use both terms. And so let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And we're going to take a look at all of those things that make up GDP. Okay, so we're going to look at the components. We're going to look a little at trade. We're going to take a look at the economic indicator from the Federal Reserve Economic Database, or FRED for short. We're going to take a look at what happens when transactions occur in these accounts. And again, take a look at exports and imports, and we'll call that net exports. Okay, so let me go. All right, so components of gross domestic product. So this is total spending. And if you added up everything that is spent by governments, consumers, businesses, and those things that are also purchased from the world and sold to the world market. So here are our four components. Consumption, this would be the households portion. Okay. Investment. Now this is a tricky one, and I want you to be very careful because it's one of those strange words that we encountered earlier. An investment does not mean stocks and bonds. What an investment means here is people that are using money to increase business. What do I mean by that? Okay. So if you start your own business and you build a building for that business, that would be considered investment. You will have inventories. You will have machinery or capital that you will use in your business. That's what we mean by investment. It is not stocks and bonds, so not financial investing, and that's how we'll differentiate the two. If I'm talking about the stock market, I'll talk about financial investment. But if I'm just talking about investment, you can liken it to the capital category of the factor of production. Okay? Government purchases. So again, I think that one's self-explanatory. And also net exports. And what net exports are anything that the U.S. sells. And if anything the U.S. sells to the rest of the world, we would call that an export from the U.S. And anything that the U.S. buys. So we would call that an import. To get net exports, we're going to take everything we sell, you can think of it as the good part of this, minus everything that we buy. And many people don't like that we're so dependent on other nations, but you saw in Chapter 3 why that is. For the United States, net exports tends to be negative. Okay, so here's our formula. Y will always equal GDP to us, okay? So Y is GDP because it's a dependent variable. What's it dependent on? On what households buy, what businesses buy and invest in themselves, what the government spends, what we sell to other countries minus what we buy from other countries. So this is what we call this little in yellow here, we call this the national accounting identity. Okay. All right, so let's talk about these a little bit more in depth because, again, just as you saw in investment, some things might not necessarily be what you think they are. When we talk about consumption, everything, the total spending by households, this is the biggest category of the national income identity. And When we talk about what do people spend money on, so there's food, housing, right? Those medical care is up there as well. So when we talk about housing costs, there's a different way that we factor in housing costs. So if you own your home, then we count things differently than if you rent it. So if you're a renter, it's pretty simple. We just include your rent payments. That's pretty straightforward. Where it gets a little odd is if you have a mortgage or if you are or if you own your home. For that, what we use is we call it the imputed rental value, which is crazy in a way. Well, it's not, because remember, GDP is within that time period. And so therefore, these are, when we make a mortgage or those kinds of things, we're kind of buying a used house. It's weird, but if a person has already lived in that house and then you purchase it, the house is used. So we wouldn't count that as part of GDP because you're not spending money on construction and some of those kinds of things. It would have been counted in GDP when it was built. And it would actually be counted in the investment category, not the consumption category. So this is a pretty important distinction. Renters, I think that makes sense. But again, if you have a used home, what we're going to do is say, okay, if you needed money and you wanted to rent out a room, how much would that rental be? So that's where we kind of get that, is actually from olden times when you'd rent out a room if you needed extra income. The investment category, and again, this is one that's very, very different depending, um, if you've had economic theory before or any kind of exposure to this. Investment is not stocks and bonds, okay? It's essentially things like capital, right? Structures. Also, here's where we're going to say houses, but they're only new houses. So if it's a new house, it'll be in the investment category. Inventories. So just like the example I used in the last objective, if General Motors makes something in quarter 1 and they don't sell it until quarter 4, then what happens is it's inventoried for those quarters in between. Okay, so just another big, hey, don't forget, when I'm talking stocks and bonds, I will always say financial investment. Government purchases is also a pretty large portion of GDP, but it is not the largest, especially when you talk about federal, state, and local levels, pretty big. Now, there are some things which are not included, and one of them is really important, and that is transfer payments. Transfer payments, so the G excludes transfer payments. What is a transfer payment? Remember, going back to the circular flow, we said there's households, and there's businesses, and the household sells land, labor, and capital to businesses, and they in turn provide rent, wages, and profit. So essentially what we're talking about here is when you get Social Security, you're not working for the government. There is no reciprocal feedback loop, okay? So for it to be included in government purchases, you have to be working for the government. And in Social Security, you're not working for the government, you're just drawing out what you paid in over the years. So if you can't find a work, you can't find a reciprocal income stream like we showed in the circular flow of the economy, then it's going to be excluded from GDP. Okay? All right, net exports, again, as I said, it's going to be what we sell to other countries, again, that foreigners buy from us, minus anything that we buy from foreigners. And we add them all up, we get this national income identity, national accounting identity, or national income accounts, kind of all the same. Okay, so I want to show you something that you're not going to find in your chapter, and I think I've been remiss sometimes in not presenting this well, but you will hear in some circles, particularly when you talk about GDP, aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is just, notice right here, hey, that's exactly what we said Y was equal to. So Y, or GDP, is equal to aggregate demand. Now, why do we use it in this form? Well, again, here's our Y's down here, right? So this is real GDP, which we'll talk about in the next objective. And this is the price level. So we would call this the CPI, which we're going to study in the next chapter, but basically the price of things. Okay, so let's start here at price level 1. Okay, and we're going to have a GDP of Y1. Okay, now let's say that we have inflation and prices start to go up. Well, think about it. If prices go up, do households want to consume as much? Probably not. Do people want to buy additional additional capital for their businesses? Probably not. Does the government want to spend on that? Probably not. So when we talk about that, what's going to happen is we're going to be spending less. And essentially here, what we're depicting is that when the price level goes up, GDP will go down. When the price level is lower, say GDP 3, then what will happen is GDP will go up because prices have went down. So all I'm showing you here is the idea that the price level will influence GDP. Okay, now we actually might see shifts of this actual curve, either a shift outward or a shift inward. I'm going to save that for a little bit later in a different objective, but I just wanted you to know that inflation, the price level, is related to the gross domestic product because it influences how much consumption, how much investment, and how much government expenditure that there is. Okay, so here is GDP, its components for 2007, just to give you an idea of what category is largest. Consumption is still the largest. I don't like outdated information, so here is information from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Okay, and this is what was brought up. Okay, so here we can see that we have real GDP, right? And notice up, 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 up until right here, first quarter 2020. Why did that happen? Well, really pretty simple, negative 4.8%. That's Corona, okay? Also want to talk to you just briefly about some of these other things that you will see. And let's go ahead and do this. Is you're going want this was due to Corona, okay? But and the other thing I wanted to mention here is that GDP will tell us basically if we're in a recession. So 3, and some authors say 2, but I like to go with 3 quarters of decreasing, not negative. This one's negative, so that's a lot. But see, notice we had a decrease here, then it leveled out. So here we had a decrease, but we're not concerned because the next quarter, it jumped up. But when you have 3 consecutive quarters of decreases, so if we see that this goes into quarter 2 and quarter 3, even though those are rebounding, we have a decrease in GDP based upon this negative out here. What we say that is a recession. Okay, so yeah. So not real great at this point in time. Okay. All right. So think that's all I wanted to show you on this particular slide. Yeah, it was. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and kill that. And we will continue on. Again, if you want to take a look at the national accounts, we can go ahead and look at those specifically. So let me just pull up what I have here. So notice, and I just always like to tell people I don't just make this stuff up, but if we look at the national accounts, notice you're going to see some pretty important information. So you're going to see here, product income, personal income. We take a look at these together and we can say, hey, that sounds like consumption. And it is. Government here, net exports right here, and then some supplemental information that we would look at as well. Investment would be income by industry, right? So that could be our investment category. And then we might also look at the savings and investment category overall. So these two added up together is kind of what we would look at. And again, you're more than welcome to play around with these tables by going back through the PowerPoint and clicking on those things. Okay, let's see. Go ahead and kill that one. And hit, let's do an erase on this. There we go. All right, so here we go. And I'm going to take you one more place. And here we are, the Federal Reserve Economic Database. And let me see if I can clean on this up for just a moment. There we go. Okay, so here is the Federal Reserve Economic Database. I wanted it live because look how cool this is. You can just hover over and it'll tell you exactly what the numbers are. Let me see if I can get out of that for just a second. Okay, so notice again, here we have the real consumption. We have gross investment, domestic investment, and exports and imports. So we have all of our national income identities here. Notice also, this is a Federal Reserve Economic Database. And so there's a few things I just want to show you. Notice that all of these gray areas are periods of recession when we have had 3 or more. This is in billions of chained 2012 dollars. Essentially what we're doing is expressing these in 2012 dollars at those prices, because remember that market prices change. That's one of the issues of doing nominal GDP. Okay, so let me clear all the drawings off that one. And let's get back into, our PowerPoint slideshow. Okay. All right. So if we want to look at GDP, and again, this is nominal GDP, we can take a look at from all the way since 1947 to 2020. And again, notice the dips. That's kind of why these areas are shaded. And if we look here, notice how that is probably trailing off this way. Now, the question is will it trail off this way and bounce right back up? Will it trail off this way and then bounce back up? Or will it kind of do something like that? That's what economists study, and that's what we try to look at. We're not really sure at this point. Okay, here's the gross domestic product by industry. So you might be interested in what your specific industry is going to be. Where do you want to land when you're done with your academic career? Knowing the GDP becomes important, because if you see consecutive downturns in that GDP, that might kind of signal to you that those jobs may not be there necessarily when you finish your degree, and we'd hate for that to happen to you. Okay, so let's try our hand at this. Determine which, if any, of the GDP components is affected. So let me write the GDP components over here. So again, remember we have consumption, government expenditures, net exports, investment, Okay, so those are your choices. Debbie spends $200 to buy her husband dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. I know I'm partial, but I think it's legal seafood. I've been to Boston. That's an incredible place to eat. Okay, so she's spending $200. That to me sounds like consumption. So I'm going to say, okay, GDP equal to consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, right? So she's spending $200. So consumption increases 200. I think GDP is going to increase by 200 as a result. Okay. All right, Sarah spends $1,800 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business. The laptop was built in China. So there are 2 points to this that are kind of important to recognize. She's going to use it in her business. So that should signal to you that this is probably an investment, right? Now, the second part is if the problem takes time to tell you where a product is from, it's probably an import or an export, depending on if we're buying or selling. So this kind of signals to me that it was an import. So let's take a look at what's going to happen. So we have GDP equal to consumption plus investment plus government purchases plus net exports. Okay, she's buying it for a publishing business, so I'm going to increase $1,800, right? Because she's buying it for her publishing, so that's an investment. She bought it from China. So remember, net exports are everything that we sell minus everything we buy from other countries. Because this was an import in China, negative 1,800, the two cancel each other out, and we end up with a GDP of 0, which is one reason why many economists don't like the idea of imports, because it does actually decrease our GDP. Some argue, however, though, that it does create jobs in other sectors. So I'll let you be the judge. Okay, let's look at the next one. Jane spends $1,200 on a computer to use in her editing business. Looks like investment. She got last year's model on sale from a great price. But here's the key. Last year's model. Remember, GDP, the final market value of all goods and services produced in that time period. So there are 2 possible answers to C. Some people like to say, well, it was in inventory, right? And inventory is part of investment. So investment is going to increase by 1,200 because she's buying it for her business, and she bought it out of somebody else's inventory. So therefore, GDP remains unchanged. That's the harder answer. The simpler answer is it's last year's model, it doesn't count. So we're just going to say, pick the one that you like, doesn't count because it's not included in GDP last year's model. Okay, let's look at our last one. General Motors builds 500 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy 470 million worth of them. Okay, so let me go ahead up here. I'm just going to write Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, right? Okay, so let's look at it. General Motors builds 500 million worth of cars. Builds 500 million worth of cars. And consumers only buy 470. So the buy sounds like consumption to me. So I'm going to increase 470, right? And let's see, they built all of them. Let's see if I can compare. 500. So what happened to the other 30 cars? Yep, it's in their inventory. So that's what D would look like. Okay. So again, we can just kind of take a look at the examples. All right. Well, that is the end of this objective. And let's see, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share. So in the next objective, we're actually going to work with mathematics of the gross domestic product. We're going to take and learn how to take that nominal GDP, which is expressed in market prices, and convert it to real GDP, which actually shows economic growth. So have a calculator handy. when you do objective 4. Thanks for your time, attention. Have a great day.